Welcome everybody. I'm going to run you through a little presentation here. So anybody that's kind of been following my shenanigans over the years knows that I have a history with the adaptive product line from EAW. I'm going to give you just a little brief rundown of how I got introduced to adaptive, and then we're going to talk about why it sounds good, okay? So a few years back, in the early days of adaptive kind of coming to the market, I think it was Rat Sound was one of the first adopters on it. And I got kind of excited by it. I thought, you know, I need to go hear that. I need to go see what's going on with that. And Bernie Broderick at the time got me to come into Hollywood, and they had a system set up there. It was probably 10 Anyas aside, something like that. And it allowed me to bring in my own console, my own Pro Tools tracks, right from the tour that I had just been mixing. And you know, of course, they were trying to sell me on all the bells and whistles of it at the time, and you know, which was great. But at the time, you know, what struck me was as soon as I turned it on and started mixing on it, I just had this moment of, man, I don't think I've ever heard anything sound like this. I was like, what? I gotta understand what is happening here, because it was just a singular column. I mean, it wasn't like this huge thing sitting in front of me, but it had three elements that I thought were really, really compelling at the time, that I needed to figure out what was happening. One was the amount of power in it. Like there was a power element to the bottom end of it where for the first time ever, on line source certainly, I thought, you know, I might be able to take this out without subwoofers. Now, I got a lot of flack for saying that, I'm telling you. But I validated that on the road when we didn't take it out with subwoofers, and I had a lot of people come and hear it. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit today, obviously. But the other piece of it was the amount of headroom in it, and there was an element of elegance to it, right? There was a high frequency element to it that I had never experienced off a line source before. So let's talk about some of that today. So this is a picture from the tour. I did 2 complete tours with Tom before we lost him on Anya. So you know, I'm a big fan of the product, obviously. It was kind of exciting for me to get to come back and actually start working for EAW and helping promote this technology again. All right, so we're going to clean up a little language today. That's going to be one of my starting points here today because, of course, over the many years that adaptive has been in play and I've been using it, I've talked to so many people that think they have understandings of it that don't really have understandings of it. And so I want to clear the air on something right away. Anya does not do beam steering. Okay, this is not a beam steering product. If we look at a typical kind of beam steer from a column, right, we would get a big chunk of energy that we can focus slightly up, slightly down, etc., right? And if we were going to try to expand that coverage or make it asymmetrical in any way, it requires a lot of calculation, a lot of computational power, a lot of filtering, and really, ironically, what we end up with is more like multiple point sources in the space and all the baggage that comes with that, okay? So I'm here to tell you today, that's not how we do this with adaptive, and hopefully I'll give you some insight into how it's done today. So the question does become, how do we beam steer? That's not the question. The question becomes, how do we adapt, right? We want to adapt our coverage capability from the speaker system into the geometry that we've defined, okay? So there are 2 steps to adapting, and I'm going to put this one up in big print right here on the screen. Create a single acoustic source. Now, we live in a time of conflation. We conflate things all the time. You know, all line sources are the same. I'm here to tell you today, all line sources are not the same. And it starts right here with this piece. Because the idea is that you want to create a single acoustic source and then hold on to it for as long as you can in the process. Almost all of the line sources that are on the market today don't even start at a single acoustic source, okay? They kind of skip right over this part and move on to the other pieces of it. So hopefully I'm going to get across to you today how important this piece of it is for our success with Anya and the adaptive line. The second piece of it, obviously, is to define a coverage, kind of define a coverage demand, and then be able to meet that with your product, right? That's the secret sauce here. So it's kind of the secret sauce of a line source with all the prediction software and everything goes. We're trying to create a geometry and fill that geometry with audio in the proper place, right? Everybody agree to that? Yeah? Okay, so let's start to creating a single acoustic source, and you're going to get bored to death with me saying that today, but I want to drive it home to you how important this is. 2 rules of creating a single acoustic source. The source size must be small relative to the desired wavelength in the passband. Say it in your head. The source size must be small. Secondly, the distance between the source acoustical centers must be equal to the size of the source. Now let that roll around in your head for a minute and then think about what is taking place in all the other systems that are out there, right? So let's take a look here. We're going to look at a single 1-inch source here, just single 1-inch source. And just as a reminder, to make sure everybody's up on board here, this is a vertical polar, right? Vertical polar. We're not looking down on the PA. We're looking at it and looking at vertical response. And we're seeing 8 different frequencies here, right? Anything from 1,000 hertz out to 12,500 hertz, okay? So this alone is going to be part of the secret to understanding how adaptive does its thing, okay? So let's move on and take a look here. If we have 2 1-inch sources spaced, right? In order to stay in the line source criteria, that means we can have up to 13 kilohertz meet the line source criteria, right? Means we can steer up to 13 kilohertz. If we were to compare that even just to 2-inch drivers, we stack a pair of 2-inch drivers now, and it's only within the line source criteria up to about 6K, right? So you can already see part of the challenge, right? That's that whole idea of the source must be small. All right, so let's take a look at what happens if we poorly space those components, right? We have the 2 1-inch drivers there spaced at about 3.5 inches, where you can kind of see what happens here, right? We get all of this interference, all of this kind of yuckiness as things start to collapse, right? Because that's how it happens as we stack things, right? This starts to happen. So this is a function of it being poorly spaced, right? We get all these artifacts up above and below the thing. No different than we would have if we took a pair of horizontal horns and put them side by side and tried to get them to interact, right? The math just simply doesn't work there. Likewise, if we just add more components, it doesn't solve the problem, right? It just exacerbates it. It makes it worse, right? We get all of this kind of trouble area around the lobe, okay? But if we stack them properly, if we keep them on the line source criteria, look at how clean that impulse is that's created there, right? It just collapses further and further down into, I don't want to call it a beam because I just told you not to do that, but this very focused piece of energy coming from the middle of the array, okay? So if you remember back to the first slide I showed you here, which is Omni versus this, you start to see how we build these adaptive rigs, right? Unlike in beam steering, where we're kind of forcing audio to go really where it doesn't want to go, in this situation in adaptive, we just have any combination of those drivers to create any combination of shape between this and this. We're actually just going to kind of release audio back to where it naturally wanted to be in the first place, right? Now, this is not Jedi mind tricks or any of that kind of stuff. It's even not really heavy-handed DSP and physics. It's pretty easy. But the actual calculation that takes place to get it into space is complex. And the guys that have done this work software-wise are just, I'll call them geniuses. I think they're geniuses. So that's the idea here, right? We're just going to, through the formation of a polar, we're going to let audio go back to where it normally wants to go, but make any shape of it we want to make, right? And that's where the whole driver density becomes really, really important. All right, so how does this make adaptive sound good, right? Well, a single adaptive enclosure meets the line source for single acoustic source. So if I look at a single box, that's a single acoustic source, right? Now, a lot of companies can build a single box that fits into that model, that space, right? And say it's a single acoustic source. The challenge becomes when we start adding more boxes and try to array it. That's when it stops becoming a single acoustic source. So let's take a look at this here. So here we have a 2-inch driver on a waveguide. This represents a single Anya enclosure, 14 drivers, right, in a line. Now, on their own, these are isophasic, right? We have that 2-inch driver on that waveguide in order to create that vertical collapse because we don't have enough drivers to create the collapse there. So we're creating it in the vertical, and then we can stack it and make more of them, right? We can fit it into a line source there. Everybody with me so far there? So I'm willing to say, okay, well, on their own, these two things are isophasic, right? They're single acoustic source for all intents and purposes. But look at what happens when we start to stack, right? If we start to create that line, so to speak. If we have 4 Anya enclosures here, you can see that the high frequency elements stack into a beautiful ribbon of audio here. Here, where we have a traditional mechanically articulated with the waveguide on them, I'm even willing to say, okay, that's pretty isophasic. There might be some spacing anomalies in it that would break it apart a little bit at high frequency, for sure. But it's fairly isophasic. But are we ever going to use it in that form? Right? Probably not. So why does this make adaptive sound good? Because we have multiple adaptive enclosures that stay within the line source criteria now, right? Multiple enclosures are still a single acoustic source. And they offer the broadest controllable bandwidth here, out to 13K, right? We're still good to 13K here. All right, so let's talk about covering the space now. Let's talk about defining the geometry now, right? So we need accurate entry of audience geometry because, you know, what we do with them, whether we're in mechanically articulated or we're in adaptive, our result is only going to be as good as the accurate information that we feed to it, right? And it's especially so for adaptive because we're not going to make a prediction of what the coverage is. The computer and the entry is actually going to create the coverage in the array, right? We're not going to interpret the data and then go, okay, we need these angles and this height. We're going to do that in software, and it's going to make the polar for us with the PA system, okay? Second is manipulate the angles, either actual or apparent, of the transducers to facilitate an even coverage of the audience geometry. Whether that even coverage is for frequency response or SPL, that's what we're trying to do. We're always looking for a balance of those two things, right? All right, so let's take a look at doing this mechanically, right? I saw this slide earlier, and I thought, you know, that's just a great way to talk about this. Here we have a straight line of drivers or devices hanging here, and here we have the mechanically articulated array, right? Well, as we start to J that array or put angling in it, what are we actually doing, right? We're kind of adding progressive delay to that J, right? We're actually breaking apart that isophasic thing that was hanging there a few minutes ago, and now high frequency, I mean, that's part of its secret when we start to break it apart is that we lose a little bit of high frequency amplitude, the math is not as good, et cetera. And we're also doing that in a pretty coarse way there, right? I mean, there's no guarantee that every driver in there has DSP control on it. So, you know, we're doing that in a pretty coarse way there compared to something that is adaptive where we can steer the audio into we can create a polar of any shape we want, whether we want it to be down, up, whatever it wants to be, right? And again, it's with using very simple techniques of progressive delay and amplitude and filtering there. Okay, so obviously when we start to take a mechanically articulated piece and we start to do angling on it, you can see where we start running into some serious impediments here, really. But we definitely are not isophasic at this point when we're doing this. We're definitely breaking it apart there. Whereas when we see this with the adaptive enclosures, you know, we may be limited strictly by the mechanical capabilities of the line source in terms of the angling, you know, on what it can actually do before we get mechanically unsafe. In the adaptive world, we can go 180 degrees up or 180 degrees down with it, right? I mean, you can go directly below it. And I promise you, if you were to look at this in measurement, even if you had the mechanically articulated hanging in one straight line versus adaptive hanging in one straight line, if you were to measure, let's say down at the bottom of that array and look at impulse, you would see all of these cabinets here. In adaptive, it looks like one cabinet, right? It does not look like you got multiple enclosures there. So again, it remains a single acoustic source regardless of where that audio is going, okay? All right, so why does that make it sound good? Because multiple enclosures can remain a single acoustic source, right? I'm just gonna keep driving this home because it's kind of the punchline at the end here as well. All right, so let's take a look at a real world application where a mechanically articulated array would be really challenged. And I'm kind of experiencing this right now out doing stadiums, doing football stadiums. So I kind of mock this up. So here we have like the back of a stadium, like a football stadium, right? So the floor you see there is really the last third of the floor in the stadium. And this is considered where we would put a delay tower, okay? So we have a delay tower that is going to try to get audio to the back upper reaches of the stadium. Now here's the important piece to remember about this. This is a secondary source of audio now, right? It's not the primary source. So delay time is critical here, right? We can't just rely on it to do full coverage. We've got to have very accurate coverage here, because whatever delay time we choose is not going to work for all three portions of this, right? You're going to pick one element of it and focus the delay time on that and hope that you can keep audio out of the other two, right? Otherwise, you're going to be destroying as much intelligibility as you save, yeah? So if you take a look at mechanically articulated, you can look at the angle that's on that, which is completely unrealistic, and it can't make it up there. So if we look at the SPLs that are here, you'll notice that we're 10 dB of difference. All the audio is actually in the lower bowl where we don't want it, yeah? So this is actually a problem. I mean, we can look at it and say, well, it looks like it's aiming up there. It's not getting any audio up there, fellas, you know? Even on a mechanically articulated array, you can't base it on the top box to the top seat. Think about how that polar is created when you collapse it, right? You got to be 3-4 boxes in up there to get energy up there, right? Let's compare that to adaptive. So 2 cabinets less, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah, 2 cabinets less here. Same trim height. Remember, in a delay rig, we're probably limited to maybe a 60-foot trim height, maybe, if we can get it. Look at the difference here, right? All the energy in that array is hitting that top balcony. And we've got probably, 3 dB of difference to the lower and almost 6 dB of difference to the bottom, right? So we can very effectively do that. And the beautiful part of it is if you're using adaptive as the primary source and you have that kind of control of start and stop coverage, well, I would probably take the primary and have it end its coverage at the beginning of the upper balcony and then just cross over the coverage between the adaptive delay and the adaptive primary. Then intelligibility is even better up there. We don't have as much emphasis on the delay time, right? So you can see the power of that right there. It's really challenged. Line source, even though it's a tremendous advantage to getting things vertically sorted out, is still very challenged in a steep environment, right? In a steep thing where we got to get audio up. That's where it's really, really tough. Here's another example of what you can do with adaptive, and this has to do with driver density, right? This has to do with us, because we're doing an adapted coverage, we can actually manipulate how many resources are being used to cover any one general area. It's kind of done within the software. So let's take this, maybe this is a festival, maybe it's a church, where we might have situations where it's like, okay, early in the day, I don't need to cover distance, I just need to cover the front of the festival. Maybe for the church, throughout the week, the main floor is typically filled with people, but they don't want to do their balcony, right? How would you handle that in line source? Traditional mechanically articulated line source, if I want to take away 25% of the allocation of the array, I'd literally have to turn it off, right? Now, if I have a bunch of cabinets that I've stacked together to steer this information down, and I start to turn them off, what actually happens? The audio starts to go back up. So you're trying to solve a problem and actually creating another one at the same time. You're releasing that audio back up. Whereas with adaptive, we don't have that issue, right? Here, if we want to say we don't want to cover the balcony, or we don't want to cover the far field, we just readapt the coverage. It's hanging in exactly the same place, and now we're using 100% of the resources in the application or the allocation that we want, right? Now, one of the knocks I've heard over time is that people that don't really understand what's going on here say, well, that whole Anya thing is not very efficient, right? Which one of these looks the more efficient, right? I'm using all my resources here, right, all the time. So yeah, this is definitely the more efficient. All right, so let's talk about subwoofers now, because we can adapt subwoofer coverage as well and be very, very directional with it. I think subwoofers are the most fun to do this with, because you can get the biggest and most grand results out of any of it. So let's take a look at an auto situation here, right? Here's an intelligent deployment to overcome a common challenge, right? So what you see in the top half are 2 split auto arrays, like a left-right auto array. And we've just used adaptive, or the ability to adapt, to take one and point it north, and one and point it more south. Get all the energy going south, one energy going north. And what does that do? That helps us eliminate the power alley, right? We can get a much more even distribution. We're taking away that summing point in the center there, right? So we're going to minimize that power alley. And similar thing here. Look at when we try to get sub information up. Remember, this is going to be a steepness issue as well, right? How many times have you been to a show where all the like a steep show, maybe it's like Red Rocks or something like that. That's the grandest example, where all the subwoofers are stacked at the bottom of the bowl, and there's just no sub coverage up the hill. Well, with adaptive, we can stack those up and actually reallocate 75% of it up the hill and steer it up the hill. And that's going to make for more coherent audio in the distance, right? So we can shape that sub coverage both vertically and horizontally here. All right, so here's the next piece of this. And I think, for my money, after many years of using adaptive, this is the hidden gem in adaptive right here. The ability to expand horizontal coverage, okay? So tell me, how many have you ever heard this? Maybe you've even said it. You know, we should go back to doing PA like we used to do it, because the low end was a lot better, right? The line sources today don't have the same bottom end that the others used to have. Anybody heard it? Anybody said it? Yeah? Does that look familiar? Barrel array, right? Kind of hanging. Okay, so really what's happening here, right? We end up with multiple articulated arrays trying to cover the horizontal space. We've put 3 disparate arrays out there now, pushing audio into the space. Whereas here, we have all of the low frequency devices in that thing mathematically working as one thing. That is the most point source low end you are ever going to hear from multiple cabinet array, right? It allows better low frequency extension, meaning if I send 30 hertz to that thing, it's going to produce it, okay? Huge impulse on it. For my money, that's a big reason why adaptive feels like it's got tons of headroom, because there's just so much bottom end impulse on it. And on the petty thing, the thing that suffered all the benefits of that was the bass guitar. There's only one source of audio in the room for the low end. I don't have subwoofers competing with it. It was magical. It was absolutely fantastic. All right, so like I said, I think this is kind of the hidden gem in adaptive, is to be able to do that and create that singular acoustic source of low frequency now, right? Now, granted, we got multiple high frequency arrays there. We've given up single acoustic source for the entire array, but now at least we got bottom end that is still single acoustic source, right? But that is very controlled. And here's the best part of it here, right? If we take a look at a mechanically articulated array where we have like maybe a main array and an auxiliary array hanging around on the side. If we take a look at a mic position, let's say we measure at the mix position or directly in front of the array, we take that mic position with the other array off, all right? Now we're going to do lobe study, right? We're going to turn off the main array and look at what the aux array looks like in that same mic position. Well, of course, what we see is all that late arriving low end and low mid from that auxiliary array, right? That would not happen with adaptive. You would see one single phase trace, even though you have 3 arrays on. It's absolutely fantastic. I got accused of cheating with this when I was out doing presentations with it. Guys would just go, I get it. You're using the same mic, but saying that it's come from up there. It's like, no, I'm not. Trust me, this is all good. So the other thing that comes with that in the adaptive world is, because we know that's how we're going to expand horizontal coverage, the distance between the drivers is predictable now. We know what it's going to be and know how it's going to respond, so software can automatically manage that low frequency in that array. So you see a target curve there, which is the middle curve. The measured would be the additional column hanging in. We would get the additional low frequency addition, and then the subsequent filter that the software would put in to get us back to the target curve, right? So again, it's all managed because it's predictable. We know where it's going to hang and how it's going to interact. So how or why does this make adaptive sound good? Well, multiple adaptive columns create a single acoustic source of low frequency. And I'll give away the game here a little bit and tell you, to me, that is one of the most important things you can accomplish in a very, very reverberant space, right? Get something that is acting like a point source at the bottom end in a reverberant space, and you are way ahead of the game here, okay? I got kind of lulled to sleep with it after using Anya for a long time, and then going back to a traditional array. I was like, oh my gosh, it was like swinging the heavy bat, So here's the last piece that I want to talk about here, and this is how any one of these array structures impact the reverberant footprint of a room, right? So to me, it's kind of down, I mean, it's all about resolution, right? And I don't mean that in the software, I mean the actual word resolution here. This is all about keeping high frequency resolution out to 13 kilohertz for the entire listening area. Somebody else is turning on their wireless mic. What can I do? All right, so like I was mentioning earlier, the adjustment in mechanically articulated array is very coarse, right? And it really does not result in high resolution, especially in the far field, right? So think of that in that way. If we talk about DSP articulated, which is kind of the hybrid, right? Kind of the Martin-esque kind of thing, where you have a J array, but there's still DSP control in it to try to create dead zones, et cetera. And then finally adaptive, right? Adaptive is going to be the most high resolution thing in the space. And that results in a better sounding reverb space. Okay? Because you have less sources in that space. If you don't believe me, try this. Go home and try this if you get some time. Go home and take your favorite reverb, Bricasti, Lexicon, AMS, I don't care what it is, and then create 3 sources, whether it's vocals or drum mix, bass guitar even, you can do it with that, and then offset each one of those by anywhere from 5 to 10 milliseconds. Add them back together and send it to the reverb and see what it makes your $5,000 reverb sound like. Yeah, it's going to suck. I mean, it just does. Especially so if you compare it to one of those things going to the reverb versus the 3 that are offset. That's very much analogous to what we're doing with these multiple line sources hanging in a reverberant space, right? We're creating all this disparate information that excites the room, right? We're putting comb filtered into a reverb space, and it's going to result in a comb filtered sounding reverb, just the way it is, okay? All right, so I think we're going to wrap it up here. So let's just review it, right? Adaptive is the only large format PA system to establish and maintain a single acoustic source throughout its process. Adaptive polar forming provides a path to superior high-end and mid-range development in the space, right? Especially for complex audience geometries, we can keep that all together. Subwoofer deployment, we can be really malleable with this. We can create almost any kind of shape with adaptive subwoofer. The coolest thing about auto is you can use a single cabinet and create cardioid if you need to do it, right? So, and anywhere in between, no matter how many cabinets you add to it. Adaptive has increased horizontal coverage through adding the additional line sources. Again, results in that single acoustic source for low frequency. And finally, adaptive delivers extremely coherent audio to a reverberant space, which is going to be much better sounding in your space. You're not going to fight that reverb so bad in the space. Okay? All right, so that's about it. Thank you for hanging in there for the whole 30 or 40 minutes there. I appreciate it. All right, so thanks for coming. If you got questions, please feel free to stop by, ask any of us. Even Audrey, she knows everything about adaptive, so ask her everything you need to know, and we'll get you sorted out. We'll answer your questions. Thank you guys for coming by. I really appreciate it. We'll see you around. Thanks.